She believed she was in control, convinced she was carrying out her duties. But when Officer Linda Carson struck a black driver during what should have been a routine traffic stop, she discovered the hard way that assumptions can destroy everything. It began on a quiet night just after 10 o'clock, exactly the sort of shift Linda preferred. In a slower part of Columbus, traffic had dwindled, and she had parked her cruiser near an empty lot, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. Then she spotted it, a sleek, black sedan easing through an intersection. It looked like the kind of car a top executive would drive. Everything seemed perfectly normal except for one detail: no turn signal. A trivial infraction, perhaps, but enough to justify a stop. Maybe Linda felt like making it clear that rules were rules. She merged onto the street and flicked on her lights. The car braked smoothly, then glided to the curb. Linda took her time getting out, setting one hand on her belt and adjusting her radio with the other. The road was nearly silent, illuminated only by faint streetlights and the occasional passing vehicle. When she approached the window, it lowered with noticeable slowness, revealing a black man in his mid-40s, sporting a neatly trimmed beard and a sharp navy suit. He looked as though he belonged in a luxury car. Both hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. He wasn't nervous or apologetic, merely waiting. "License and registration," she said more forcefully than necessary. The man blinked once, then reached for his glove box, moving with a controlled smoothness that suggested he already knew what Linda might be thinking. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was measured, cool. Linda crossed her arms. "Failed to signal a turn?" A brief pause, a quiet breath. "Did I?" Something about his polite but challenging tone riled her. "License and registration," she repeated. Without a word, he handed over the documents. He wasn't flustered or offering excuses, just calm. Linda barely glanced at his name before setting the ID aside. That collected attitude got under her skin. "You live around here?" she asked, her voice tight. He exhaled softly, as though making a silent point. "I'm not sure that's relevant." Her grip on his license grew tighter. She had spent over a decade on the force, long enough to sense when someone doubted her authority. Straightening up, she said, "Step out of the vehicle." For the first time, the man's expression shifted slightly. His jaw tensed. He tilted his head. "Why?" Linda's voice cooled further. "I told you to step out." A muscle in his jaw flexed, but he didn't protest. He sighed, unbuckled, and opened the door. Linda stepped back as he rose. He was taller and broader than she expected, standing there without hostility, yet carrying himself with a calmness that made her heart pound. "Hands on the trunk," she ordered. He exhaled once more, a long, slow breath, then placed his palms on the metal. Linda felt her pulse hammer. This was the moment she could show him who held the power. She pressed a hand against his back, nudging him downward. He stiffened, and something inside her snapped. Before she realized what she was doing, her palm struck his cheek in a sharp crack that echoed on the empty street. He jerked to the side, body frozen. Time seemed to stall. Then slowly he turned back, his face as blank as stone, jaw clenched once before he inhaled. With controlled deliberation, he reached into his jacket pocket. Linda's stomach twisted, imagining the worst, but instead he pulled out an ID. Nathaniel Grant. She glanced down at the text beneath his name. Chief of Police. Her boss. Linda's pulse thundered. Her arms felt numb, as if the ground beneath her had caved in. But Chief Grant simply held the ID, his gaze cool, unblinking. He didn't shout or demand an explanation. That distant composure alarmed Linda more than any outburst would have. Her breath stumbled in her throat, thoughts colliding, no real words forming. She could practically hear her own heartbeat echo in her chest. "Chief Grant, She trailed off. No excuse would sound anything but desperate now. Suddenly, another voice cut the silence. "Everything okay here, Officer Carson?" Linda spun around. Another patrol car had arrived, lights flashing blue and red over the scene. Officer Reynolds, her usual partner, was only a few steps away, looking confused. Linda opened her mouth, but Grant spoke first. "Everything's fine," he said smoothly, tucking his ID back into his pocket. "Your officer was just running a stop." Reynolds glanced at him, then back at Linda, raising an eyebrow. Sir, Grant kept his gaze on Linda. Am I free to go? Linda's mind raced. Let him leave and pray he wouldn't file a complaint? Or try to reclaim control? She licked her dry lips. A low chuckle escaped Grant's throat. No warmth in it, just something cold. Officer Carson, he said, tilting his head, are you detaining me? She felt Reynolds staring, bewildered. The words caught in her throat. No, sir. Grant nodded slowly, then turned to Reynolds. Good to know there are still professionals on this force. Then he stepped into his car without waiting for a response and drove off into the darkness, taillights fading. Linda stood frozen. Reynolds approached, clearly perplexed. Linda, what in the world was that? You look like you've seen a ghost. What did he say? But Grant hadn't really said anything, no insults or open threats, only that crushing silence. She shook her head. Nothing. Forget it. Reynolds observed her for a moment more, then offered to handle the paperwork. As he headed back to his cruiser, Linda opened her car door. Dread pressed down on her. Nathaniel Grant had let her walk away, no scene, no immediate blowback. But she knew it was only the beginning. She barely slept. All night she lay there, replaying the moment over and over. The look on Grant's face, how he merely let her walk away. By morning, she felt a queasy knot in her stomach. Her phone buzzed. A message from Internal Affairs telling her to report to the chief's office immediately. Driving to the station, she kept her grip iron tight on the steering wheel. Everyone seemed to sense that something was off. Officers in the hall offered sidelong glances. A break room door half opened, whispers leaking out. Linda forced herself to ride the elevator up, each second feeling like a minute. Finally, she reached Grant's office and stepped in. He was at his desk, file in hand, with Captain Howard standing nearby. Officer Carson, he said evenly, take a seat. Linda's legs felt stiff as she sat. Grant leaned back, calm and collected. After a pause, he asked, how would you report last night's stop? Her mouth was dry. Routine stop for failure to signal. He nodded as though expecting that. And then? Linda's heart thumped in her ears. I asked for ID. He was uncooperative. Grant's brow rose slightly. Uncooperative? She clenched her jaw. He questioned why he was being stopped. Grant turned to Captain Howard. Is questioning an officer considered uncooperative? Howard looked unmoved. Not unless the driver refuses to comply. Grant's stare settled on Linda. Did I refuse, Officer Carson? Her hands gripped her thighs. No, sir. Grant gave a slow nod. Then why did you hit me? Her chest constricted. Howard said nothing, only watching her carefully. Grant's tone stayed calm, but there was steel underneath. Did you feel threatened? Did I resist? Did I insult you? Linda felt nauseous. No, sir. His gaze stayed on her. Then what caused you to strike me? She couldn't form an answer. Grant let the silence hang. Finally, he took a breath and slid a paper across the desk. A suspension notice. You're off duty until further notice. He stood before she could protest. Dismissed. As Linda stumbled out, reeling, she heard him say, We're not done. She knew that was no idle warning. She went home to her couch, reading the words, Indefinite administrative leave pending review, over and over. She had never been suspended before, and now, for the first time in 15 years, she had no badge, no sense of control. Her phone buzzed. Nathaniel Grant was calling. With trembling fingers, she answered. Carson, meet me at Riverside Park in 10 minutes, he said. The line went dead. The park was mostly empty when she arrived. A few people jogged or walked dogs under the flickering streetlights. She spotted Grant near the water, hands tucked into his pockets. She considered turning back, but some force pushed her forward. You wanted to see me? She asked quietly. Grant didn't turn. Do you know why I didn't go to IA myself? She had wondered about that from the start. Then he turned. Because I needed you to sit with it. Really feel it. She bristled. I do. No, he said, voice steady. Not yet. She frowned. Then, what is this? Grant motioned to a nearby bench. Sit. She hesitated but complied. He took a seat beside her, elbows on his knees, gazing at the water. Ever been pulled over yourself, Carson? he asked. She blinked. What? A routine stop, he clarified. Lights behind you, asking for license and registration, wanting to know where you live? Linda shook her head. Once, maybe twice. Grant exhaled. I've lost count. Every city I've lived in, I've been stopped and asked why I was there, even in my own neighborhood. Linda looked down, unsure how to respond. Grant leaned back. You struck me because my calmness annoyed you. You wanted me to be scared. When I wasn't, it made you angry. Do you see that? Her throat felt tight. She wanted to protest that she wasn't a racist cop, but the truth gnawed at her. Grant's voice hardened just a fraction. You call it whatever you want, but what else do you call it when you assume someone's a threat simply for existing? Silence clung to them. At last he sighed. I didn't bring you here to rip you apart, Carson. You have a choice. Pretend it was just a slip-up, or really dig into why it happened. She stared at the dark water, unable to speak. Grant stood. Internal Affairs will talk to you again. They'll want to see if you've learned something. Figure out your answer. Then he walked away, leaving Linda alone in the night, with the weight of her actions pressing down on her. For 3 days, the phone stayed silent. It felt like the department had erased her. No calls, no messages from her usual coworkers. She had too much time to think, and thinking led back to Grant's words. Sit with it. She realized she had never viewed herself as someone who lost control. Yet that night she had, and she hated the memory. On the 4th day, Internal Affairs summoned her. Driving there, she felt every nerve on edge. In the conference room, Captain Howard sat with Investigator Harris and Grant, hands folded, gaze lowered. Harris asked about the stop, flipping through notes. You pulled him over for a turn signal violation. At what point did it become physical? Linda swallowed. I struck the driver after asking him to exit the vehicle. Why? Harris pressed. She had no excuses left. I lost my temper. Harris raised his brows, then skimmed another page. You stated you believed the driver was being uncooperative. Linda's fists curled in her lap. I assumed he was resisting, but he wasn't. Grant lifted his eyes, meeting hers. Assumed, he repeated. The silence weighed down the room. Finally, Harris closed the file. Officer Carson, you've served 15 years with no prior issues. That helps. But using force without justification is serious. We recommend a minimum 60-day suspension without pay and mandatory training in de-escalation and bias awareness. A second offense will result in termination. Linda nodded, her lungs feeling tight. Understood. She stood to leave. At the door, Grant spoke in a calm voice that still held power. Carson, this isn't finished. She gripped the knob, forcing herself to breathe, knowing he was right. The real work was yet to come. Outside, she sat in her car, clutching the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. She should have felt relief she hadn't been fired, but she felt only shame. She'd let her assumptions control her. She'd used her authority wrongly and escaped with a harsh suspension and training sessions. At her first bias training class, Linda felt embarrassment roil in her stomach. About a dozen other officers filled the small room. The instructor, a retired detective named Joanna Pierce, clicked a projector remote. A grainy body cam video played, showing a black driver pulled over for a minor infraction by a white officer who kept escalating and becoming combative. The driver's hands were in plain sight, voice measured, but none of that mattered. The officer lost his temper. When the clip ended, Pierce folded her arms. Let's talk about assumptions. Silence. Then she turned to Linda. Officer Carson, what did that officer see when he stopped the man? Linda struggled with her words. He saw a threat. Pierce nodded. And what did you see when you pulled over Chief Grant? Linda's throat felt like sandpaper. She had to force the words out. A threat. Pierce tilted her head. Was he a threat? Linda swallowed. No. Pierce's voice gentled, but the question stung. Then where did that idea come from? For the first time, Linda let herself admit she didn't have a quick excuse. Perhaps years of subtle cues and training had primed her to see certain people as suspects if they didn't show fear. Linda thought she wasn't biased, but that night proved otherwise. She met Pierce's gaze, breathing unsteadily. Good, Pierce said softly, as though approving Linda's honesty. 2 months passed. Linda returned to the precinct, stepping inside with her uniform pressed and her nerves drawn taut. The hustle and bustle hadn't changed. Phones ringing, footsteps echoing on the tile. But some of the officers glanced up, curious. She squared her shoulders, heading for her desk. Before she could sit, someone passed by. Nathaniel Grant. He walked toward his office, not saying a word. At the door he paused, glancing over his shoulder. Carson. She straightened. Sir. A slight pause, then, welcome back. Linda swallowed hard. Thank you, Chief. Grant nodded once and disappeared into his office. For the first time in weeks, Linda exhaled, aware she'd been offered another shot. It was up to her to do better. Prejudice isn't always blatant. It isn't always delivered through slurs or open hate. Sometimes it's quiet. It's in those split-second judgments, fueled by fear and old conditioning. The question isn't whether it exists, but whether you're willing to face it, and what you'll do when you realize it's there. If this story made you reflect, share it. Let's start the conversations that truly matter.